Close on Karen's eyes, she stands beneath the creaking structure of the gas station while forest mist swallows the rest of the world. Her late husband's will was an insult. While her daughter-in-law received the mansions and money, Karen inherited only the skeleton of a 100-year-old gas station rotting in the heart of a dense forest. Her daughter-in-law laughed, saying Karen had finally found a place as forgotten as herself, but Karen wasn't there to cry. She knew something her daughter-in-law never imagined. That station wasn't built to sell gasoline. It was built to hide what the world wasn't ready to see. The moment Karen turned the valve on pump number 1, the sound that echoed from the ground wasn't fuel rising, but a secret buried since 1926 finally awakening. Before I show you what Karen released from those depths, and how it brought her daughter-in-law to her knees in panic, subscribe to the channel. Because what you're about to see proves that karma doesn't sleep. It just waits for the right moment. Prepare yourself, because what lay beneath the boards of that station changed Karen's story, and it will change your perception of what true power means. Karen Blackwell had been married to Marcus for 42 years when he died. She was 68 years old, and in those 4 decades, she'd learned that silence was often more powerful than words. Marcus had built a trucking empire from nothing, a fleet of 38 trucks that transported goods across the country. Karen had been his partner in every way that mattered, managing the books, handling logistics, keeping the business running while Marcus drove routes in the early years. When their son Thomas died in a trucking accident 15 years ago, it nearly destroyed them both. But they survived it together, pouring their grief into work, into building something Thomas would have been proud of. Then Marcus died suddenly of a heart attack at 71, and Karen's world shifted. She'd expected to inherit the business they'd built together. She'd expected to continue the legacy. What she didn't expect was Vivienne. Vivienne had married Thomas 20 years ago, shortly before his death. She was beautiful, charming, ambitious. Everything Karen was not. After Thomas died, Vivienne had stayed close to Marcus, positioning herself as the devoted daughter-in-law, the keeper of Thomas's memory. Karen had never trusted her, but Marcus had been blind to it. "She loved our son," he'd say. "That makes her family." The day of the will reading, Karen sat in the lawyer's office in her simple black dress, hands folded in her lap. Vivienne arrived, dressed in expensive designer clothes, her blonde hair perfect, her smile radiant. The lawyer, Mr. Jameson, cleared his throat and began reading. The business, the entire trucking company, went to Vivienne. The house Marcus and Karen had lived in for 30 years went to Vivienne. The investment accounts, the savings, the vehicles, all to Vivienne. Karen sat perfectly still, her face showing nothing. Mr. Jameson looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Blackwell, there is one more item. Marcus left you a property." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a deed to 5 acres of forest land, 40 miles outside the city, and a key, old rusted, attached to a tag that read, Station 1926. "What is this?" Vivienne asked, leaning over to look. "It's an old gas station," Mr. Jameson explained. "Built in 1926. It's been in Marcus's family for generations. The road was rerouted decades ago, so there's no traffic. The structure is still standing but abandoned." Vivienne laughed, a bright, cruel sound. "A gas station in the middle of nowhere. How perfect." She turned to Karen. "Marcus finally gave you what you deserve, a place to wait for time to pass. Just don't expect any customers." Karen picked up the folder and the key. She looked at Vivienne for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. Then she stood, nodded to Mr. Jameson, and walked out without a word. Behind her she heard Vivienne laughing with Mr. Jameson about the absurdity of the inheritance. Outside, sitting in her old sedan, Karen opened the folder again. Along with the deed was a handwritten note from Marcus, dated a week before his death. "My dearest Karen, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive, but I always knew you'd understand when the time came. The station isn't what it seems. Trust your instincts. Trust what we built together. The answer is in the silence. All my love, Marcus." Karen read the note 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the folder. Marcus had left her a message. He'd left her something Vivian couldn't understand, and Karen, who'd spent 42 years learning her husband's mind, knew that this wasn't an insult. It was an invitation. She started her car and drove toward the forest, toward the station, toward whatever truth Marcus had hidden there. The drive took 90 minutes on progressively smaller roads. Paved highway became county route, then gravel path, then finally a barely visible dirt track that disappeared into dense forest. Karen followed it carefully, her sedan bumping over roots and ruts. The forest here was old growth, massive trees that blocked out the sun, creating a twilight atmosphere even at midday. Mist hung between the trunks like curtains. It felt like driving into another world. Then she saw it. The gas station emerged from the mist like a ghost. It was a beautiful ghost. The structure was pure 1926 Art Deco. White stucco walls now covered in moss and climbing vines, but the bones were intact. Two vintage gas pumps stood like sentinels under a curved canopy, supported by elegant pillars. The main building had large windows, now dusty but unbroken, and a door painted deep red that had faded to rust brown. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Blackwell Station, S 1926. Karen parked and got out slowly, taking in the scene. The station sat in a perfect clearing, as if the forest had agreed to give it space. Wildflowers grew between the cracked concrete. Birds sang in the surrounding trees. It was isolated, yes. Abandoned, certainly, but not ruined. Someone had maintained this place, at least minimally, for a very long time. Karen approached the door and tried the rusted key. It took effort, but the lock turned. The door opened with a creak that echoed through the forest. Inside, the station was a time capsule. A wooden counter ran along one wall, made of beautiful carved oak now covered in dust. Shelves that once held supplies stood empty but intact. A pot-bellied stove sat in one corner. The floor was wide planks of hardwood, surprisingly solid under Karen's feet. And everywhere there was that silence Marcus had mentioned, a profound quiet that felt almost sacred. Karen walked slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing softly. She ran her hand along the counter, feeling the quality of the craftsmanship. Marcus's grandfather had built this. She'd heard stories about it years ago, how the old man had chosen this location, built this beautiful station, been so proud of it. Then, the highway rerouted, and the station became obsolete almost immediately. The family had kept it, but never spoke of it much. A curiosity, a white elephant, except Marcus's note suggested it was something more. Karen moved behind the counter, examining the space. There were old ledgers on a shelf, their pages yellowed but preserved. She opened one carefully. The entries stopped in 1945. Calculations for fuel, supplies, maintenance. Nothing unusual. She was about to close it when something caught her eye. A sketch in the margin. A small drawing of the gas pumps outside, but with arrows pointing downward, and the word ventilation in tiny script. Karen set down the ledger and went back outside to examine the pumps. They were beautiful vintage pieces, the kind collectors would pay fortunes for. But as she looked closer, she noticed something odd. The display windows that should show gallons pumped were dark, and behind the glass, instead of numbers, there were what looked like compass markings. Coordinates. Karen's heart began to beat faster. She walked around the station, examining its position. The clearing was unnaturally circular. The station sat at the exact center, and the road, what remained of it, didn't actually lead anywhere. It stopped at the station. This wasn't a gas station positioned to serve travelers. This was a marker, a landmark, something built to indicate a specific location. Karen went back inside, her mind racing. She examined the counter more carefully, running her hands over the wood, looking for anything unusual. And there, on the side facing away from the door, she found it. A small carved symbol, the same symbol that was on her wedding ring. Marcus had given her that ring on their 10th anniversary. "It was my grandfather's mark," he'd told her, "for things that matter." Karen looked at her ring, then at the carving. They matched perfectly. With trembling hands she pressed the symbol. Nothing happened. She tried turning the ring against it. Still nothing. Then she remembered Marcus's note. The answer is in the silence. She stood perfectly still in that quiet station, thinking. Silence. What creates silence? What fills it? And then she understood. She went to the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Inside, instead of ash, she found a small metal box, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Inside the box was a second key, newer than the station key, made of brass, with a tag that read simply 1. Karen took the key and went back outside to pump number 1. There was a small panel at the base of the pump, nearly invisible under decades of grime. She cleaned it off and found a keyhole. The brass key fit perfectly. When she turned it, she heard something that made her breath catch. A deep, mechanical sound from beneath the ground, not the gurgle of fuel, something much more substantial. The sound of gears engaging, of mechanisms waking after a very long sleep. The concrete around the pumps trembled slightly, then stopped. Karen waited, but nothing else happened. She went back inside, frustrated. What had the key activated? What was she missing? She stood behind the counter again, looking at the carved symbol, thinking about Marcus, about his grandfather, about 100 years of family secrets. And then she saw it, the counter itself, the beautiful oak counter that ran the length of the room. She examined it more closely and realized it wasn't just a counter. It was a mechanism. The wood was joined in a way that suggested it could move. She pressed the carved symbol again, this time pushing harder, and the counter shifted. It slid backward smoothly, silently, revealing that the top was hinged. Karen lifted it. Beneath the counter was a panel of brass switches and dials, all labeled with numbers. Pump 1, Pump 2, office, store, canopy. This was a control panel. For what? Karen thought about the mechanical sound she'd heard. The key had activated something. These switches must control it. With a deep breath, she flipped the switch labeled office, and the floor began to move. The section of hardwood floor beneath the counter slid aside with barely a whisper, revealing steps that descended into shadow. Not rough cellar steps carved from earth and stone, but elegant marble stairs that gleamed even in darkness, their surface polished smooth by time. The edges were lined with intricate brass railings that caught what little light filtered down from above. And as the floor panel completed its silent journey backward, lights flickered on automatically, electric lights powered by some hidden source, illuminating the stairway with a warm amber glow that shouldn't be possible in an abandoned building that had no connection to any power grid. Karen stood at the threshold, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in the profound silence. This was what Marcus had left her. This was the secret he'd protected all these years, the truth his grandfather had built a century ago. This was why the station existed in this impossible location, why the road led nowhere, why the pumps measured coordinates instead of gallons. She gripped the brass railing and began her descent, moving carefully on the marble steps. Each footfall echoed softly in the enclosed space. The air grew noticeably cooler as she went down, carrying with it a faint scent of cedar and old paper, the smell of things carefully preserved. The stairway spiraled gently, following the curve of what must be a massive shaft dug deep into the bedrock beneath the forest floor, 20 feet down, 30, 40. Karen counted her steps, losing track somewhere around 60. The stairs went deeper than any normal basement, deeper than seemed possible for a structure built in secret 100 years ago. What kind of resources had Marcus's grandfather commanded? What kind of vision had driven him to carve this sanctuary from solid stone? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes, the stairs opened into a chamber. Karen stopped at the bottom step, one hand still gripping the brass railing, and simply stared, overwhelmed by what she was seeing. It was a vault, but calling it merely a vault was like calling the ocean merely water, but not like any bank vault. This was a vast underground room that seemed to defy the physics of what could exist beneath an abandoned gas station. The chamber stretched perhaps 60 feet in length and 40 in width, with a vaulted ceiling that rose 15 feet overhead. The ceiling itself was a work of art, coffered panels of dark wood alternating with decorative plasterwork that would have been at home in a European cathedral. From the center hung a magnificent chandelier, its crystals catching and fracturing the light from dozens of electric bulbs. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with mahogany cabinets, each fronted with glass doors that revealed drawers and shelves within. Every cabinet was labeled with small brass plaques, dates, categories, catalog numbers. The floor was polished stone, some kind of grey marble veined with white, so perfectly laid that Karen could see her reflection in its surface. And running down the center of the room, dividing it like an aisle in a church, were glass display cases mounted on elegant wooden pedestals. Karen walked forward slowly, almost afraid to disturb the perfection of the space. Her footsteps echoed off the stone, a soft rhythm that seemed to wake the chamber from its 100-year sleep. The air here was dry and temperature-controlled. She could hear a faint hum from somewhere, machinery maintaining perfect conditions for preservation. How was this possible? How had power been maintained for a century? She approached the nearest display case and looked inside, her breath catching at what she saw. Jewelry, not costume pieces, but exquisite works of art from another era. A diamond necklace that caught the light and threw rainbows across the case, each stone the size of her thumbnail. An emerald bracelet with stones so green they seemed to glow with their own light. A ruby brooch shaped like a phoenix, wings spread in eternal flight. Each piece sat on a bed of deep blue velvet, carefully positioned for display, and beside each piece was a small card, handwritten in beautiful script, identifying its provenance. Property of Helena Rothschild, Vienna. Deposited March 15, 1938. Karen's hand went to her mouth. 1938, just after the Anschluss, when Austria fell to Nazi Germany. Helena Rothschild had brought her family's treasures here, to this impossible vault beneath an American forest, trying to save what she could before fleeing for her life. The next case held a different collection. Property of the Vandermeer family, Amsterdam. Deposited May 9, 1941, days before the Netherlands fell. Case after case told similar stories. Property of Maria Konstantinova, St. Petersburg. Deposited 1944. The war. Always the war. People fleeing across oceans, carrying what they could, desperate to preserve some piece of their heritage, their history, their identity, in the face of annihilation. Not just jewelry, but documents, photographs, small precious items, each carefully labeled with a name and date. Karen moved to the cabinets along the wall. Inside were larger items, paintings wrapped in protective cloth, sculptures, books, more documents. Every item was catalogued, preserved, waiting. On a desk at the far end of the vault was a leather journal. Karen opened it and found Marcus's grandfather's handwriting. 1926. I have built the repository. The station above is merely the entrance. What lies below is a promise, a place of safety for those who must flee, who must hide what they cannot carry. We will keep their treasures until they return, and if they do not return, the items will remain held in trust until the law allows their transfer to the keeper of this place. My family will maintain this trust for as long as it takes. This is our covenant. This is our silence. Karen read page after page. Marcus's grandfather had been part of a network that helped people escape from pogroms, from war, from persecution. The station was positioned precisely because it was isolated. People could come in secret, deposit their valuables, receive a receipt, and flee. If they survived, they could reclaim their property. If they didn't, after 100 years, according to the obscure custody laws of that era, the items would belong to the property holder. The last entry was from Marcus, dated 6 months before his death. The 100 years have passed for most deposits. I have maintained this place as my grandfather wished. Karen, if you are reading this, know that everything here is now legally yours. More importantly, know that I trusted you with this because you understand what matters. The value isn't in the objects, it's in the keeping of faith. Do with this what your conscience tells you. I love you, I trust you, always. Marcus. Karen sat down heavily in the desk chair, tears finally coming. Marcus hadn't just left her a vault of treasures. He'd left her a legacy of trust, of keeping faith with people who'd hoped to return but never could. She thought about Vivian, celebrating her inheritance of the trucking company. Vivian had no idea that this existed. She'd laughed at the worthless gas station, and she had no idea that beneath the forest floor was a fortune that would make the trucking company look like pocket change. But as Karen sat in that silent vault, surrounded by the desperate hope of people long dead, she understood something Vivian never would. This wasn't just about money. This was about dignity, about keeping promises across generations, about being trusted with other people's last treasures. She stood and began examining the vault more carefully. In one of the cabinets, she found something that made her stop cold, a folder labeled Blackwell Family Trust. Inside were documents, financial records, transfers, account statements, and as Karen read through them, a picture emerged that made her blood run cold. Vivian had been embezzling from the company for years. She'd systematically drained accounts, sold assets, moved money into her own name. Marcus probably never knew. He'd trusted her completely. The company Vivian had inherited was nearly worthless. She'd already stolen everything valuable from it. But these documents proved it all. Every fraudulent transfer, every forged signature, every theft. Marcus's grandfather must have started keeping family financial records down here. Marcus had continued it. And now Karen held proof of every crime Vivian had committed. She gathered the documents carefully, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Then she returned upstairs, closed the vault, reset the counter, and locked the station. She had decisions to make. But first, she had a fortune to secure and a legacy to honor. Over the next 3 months, Karen worked in careful silence. She hired a lawyer, not Mr. Jameson, but someone she'd researched carefully. Together, they verified the custody laws, confirmed her ownership of the vault's contents, and began the process of documenting everything. She also hired contractors, discreet professionals who could work without asking too many questions. She had them install proper security at the station, upgrade the electrical and plumbing systems, restore the structure. The vault itself needed no work. Marcus and his family had maintained it perfectly for a century, but Karen transformed the station above into something livable. She added a small apartment in the back room, furnished simply but comfortably. She cleaned and restored the main space, bringing the beautiful 1926 architecture back to life. She kept the vintage character, but added modern conveniences hidden behind period details. The gas pumps, now properly understood as ventilation and access points for the vault below, she restored to pristine condition. They became beautiful sculptures, markers of what lay beneath, and she began the delicate work of liquidating some of the vault's contents. Not all of it. She would never betray the trust Marcus's grandfather had established, but items that were clearly orphaned, with no possibility of heirs claiming them, she sold through auction houses and private dealers. The first piece, a diamond necklace that had belonged to a baroness who died in 1942 with no surviving family, sold for $340,000. A painting by a forgotten master brought $500,000. A collection of rare books fetched $200,000. Within 3 months, Karen had liquidated nearly $2 million in assets, with the vast majority of the vault's contents still intact. She invested carefully, living modestly from the interest while keeping the principal secure, and she waited. Because she knew Vivian, knew her ambition, her greed, her arrogance, and she knew that eventually Vivian would come. The first sign was the tax assessment. The county suddenly revalued Karen's 5 acres of worthless forest land, increasing its assessed value 20-fold. Someone had tipped them off that the land might be valuable, that someone could only be Vivian, trying to force Karen into a financial corner. The second sign was the environmental preservation notice. A group Karen had never heard of filed a petition to have the forest declared a protected preserve, which would require Karen to forfeit her property. The group's largest donor, she discovered, was a shell company owned by Vivian. Vivian was trying to take the land from her. She thought Karen was a desperate old woman living in a shack, unable to fight back. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Karen prepared carefully. She had the vault contents fully appraised and documented. She had security cameras installed throughout the property. She had her lawyer prepare several sets of documents, and then she waited for Vivian to make her move. It came on a grey morning in late October, when mist hung so thick between the trees that visibility dropped to mere feet. Sharon was in the station, seated in her favourite chair by the restored window, reading a leather-bound first edition she'd found among the vault's treasures, a novel by an author who'd perished in the camps, his work nearly lost to history. The book was a reminder of why the vault mattered, why the keeping of faith across generations was sacred work. She heard the car before she saw it, an expensive engine struggling over the rutted dirt track, clearly not designed for such terrain. Through the mist, Vivian's white luxury SUV emerged like a ghost, its paint already mud-splattered, its undercarriage scraping audibly on exposed roots. Karen set down her book carefully, marking her place. She'd known this moment would come, had been preparing for it since the first tax assessment notice arrived. She walked to her bedroom with measured steps, opened her closet with steady hands. She selected her outfit as carefully as a general choosing armor before battle. A simple black dress, beautifully cut from expensive fabric, understated elegance that spoke of wealth worn comfortably, low heels that added height without sacrificing stability, and around her neck she clasped the Baroness's diamond necklace. The piece was extraordinary, 3 strands of perfectly matched stones, each diamond flawless, the whole thing worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Helena Rothschild had deposited it here in 1938, never to return. After verifying there were no living heirs, Karen had sold it through a private auction for $340,000. Then, in a move that had pleased her immensely, she'd bought it back at the same price from the buyer, a wealthy collector who understood that some pieces deserved to be worn, not locked in a vault. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror. At 68, she was still striking in ways that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with presence. Silver hair pulled back in a classic chignon that emphasized her strong bone structure. Dark eyes that had learned to see through lies and pretense. Posture that came from a lifetime of carrying herself with dignity even when others tried to diminish her. She looked, she thought, with quiet satisfaction, like exactly what she was. A woman who knew her worth, who understood that power came not from what you took, but from what you were trusted to keep, who had learned that silence was often the most devastating response to those who expected her to break. Karen returned to the main room and settled back in her chair, book in hand, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Vivian knocked sharply on the restored red door, 3 aggressive raps that echoed in the quiet, then entered without waiting for a response, as was her habit. She clearly expected to find Karen in desperate circumstances, living in squalor, weakened and ready to surrender. Instead, she stopped 3 steps inside the door, her practiced speech dying on her lips. The station was transformed. The interior glowed with warm light from carefully chosen fixtures. The wood floor gleamed. The oak counter shone with fresh polish. Comfortable furniture, tasteful art, subtle technology integrated seamlessly with the 1926 architecture. Everything spoke of money, taste, and quiet confidence. And Karen sat in the middle of it all, diamonds at her throat, calmly reading as if visits from hostile relatives were merely minor interruptions to her peaceful day. "My God, Karen, you look—" She trailed off, taking in the necklace, the restored interior, the quiet confidence. "I look well," Karen finished calmly. "Thank you for noticing. Please sit." She gestured to the chair across from her. Vivian sat, visibly reassessing. "The station looks different. I've made some improvements. It's a beautiful building. It deserved to be restored. That must have been expensive. How did you—" "I manage," Karen said simply. Vivian's eyes kept returning to the necklace. "That's a remarkable piece of jewelry, isn't it? It belonged to a baroness once. I find it fits me well." Karen set down her book and gave Vivian her full attention. "But you didn't drive all this way to discuss my jewelry. What brings you to my home?" Vivian shifted, uncomfortable under that steady gaze. "I wanted to discuss the property, the land. I've been thinking it's not safe for you to be out here alone at your age. I've found a lovely assisted living facility in the city. I'm 68, Vivian, not 90, and I'm quite safe here. But the environmental group, the group you're funding through a shell company? Karen's voice remained perfectly calm. Yes, I'm aware of that, just as I'm aware of the tax assessment you arranged. Did you think I wouldn't trace it back to you? Vivian's face flushed. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. You want this land. You've been trying to force me off it. What I can't quite understand is why. It's just an old gas station in the forest. What could you possibly want with it? It's not about what I want, Vivian said sharply. It's about what's practical. You're living in a shack in the middle of nowhere. It's pathetic. I'm trying to help you. Karen smiled slightly. How kind. Tell me, Vivian, how is the trucking company doing? The change of subject caught Vivian off guard. It's fine. Profitable. Is it? That's interesting. Because the financial records I have suggest otherwise. They suggest the company is actually quite hollow, that most of its valuable assets were sold off over the past several years. That money was systematically transferred into accounts you controlled. Vivian went very still. I don't know what you think you found, but would you like to see the documents? Karen asked pleasantly. They're quite detailed. Every fraudulent transfer, every forged signature, including Marcus's signature on documents dated after his death. That was a particularly bold touch. The color drained from Vivian's face. Where did you? Marcus kept excellent records. So did his grandfather. They were very thorough men. Karen stood up. Would you like to see where they kept them? Without waiting for an answer, she walked behind the counter. Vivian followed, transfixed. Karen pressed the carved symbol and lifted the counter, revealing the control panel. She flipped the switch, and the floor slid open. Come, Karen said, starting down the stairs. Let me show you what you tried to take from me. They descended into the vault. The lights came on automatically, illuminating the chamber. Vivian gasped. What is this? A century of keeping faith, Karen said quietly. Marcus's grandfather built it to protect people who had to flee, to keep their treasures safe until they could return. Most never did. After 100 years, the contents became mine, legally, completely. She gestured to the cases, the cabinets. You laughed when I inherited a gas station. You thought Marcus had left me ruins. He left me a legacy worth more than everything you stole. Vivian walked between the cases, staring at the jewelry, the art, the preserved treasures. This is worth millions, Karen finished. Tens of millions. I've had it appraised. She walked to the desk and picked up a folder. But this is worth more to me than all of it. She opened the folder, showing Vivian the financial documents. Proof of every crime you committed, every theft, every fraud. Marcus trusted you and you robbed him blind. Vivian's face was white. You can't prove. I can prove everything. The question is whether I will. Karen closed the folder. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over the trucking company to me, what's left of it. You're going to leave this city and never return. You're going to disappear from my life completely. And in exchange, these documents stay in this vault. No police, no prosecution, just silence. And if I refuse, Vivian's voice was barely a whisper, then I take everything to the district attorney. You'll spend the next 10 years in prison. You'll lose everything anyway, but you'll lose your freedom too. Choose. They stood in the vault, surrounded by a century of secrets, and Vivian finally understood. Sharon wasn't a desperate old woman. She was a keeper of silence, a holder of truths, a woman who understood that real power didn't come from what you took, but from what you were trusted to keep. I'll sign, Vivian whispered. I'll disappear. Good, Caron said calmly. My lawyer will bring the papers tomorrow. Sign them and go. And Vivian, she waited until the younger woman met her eyes. You wanted to bury me in this forest. You wanted me to disappear into these ruins. Instead, you gave me the keys to your own ending. Remember that. Remember that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones you think you can dismiss, we're the ones who survive. The next day, Vivian signed the papers and left the city. Karen never saw her again. 6 months after Vivian signed the papers and disappeared from the city, some said she'd moved to Florida. Others claimed California, but Karen neither knew nor cared. The station had transformed once again. But this time, the transformation served a purpose larger than Karen alone. The Blackwell Foundation operated from the beautifully restored 1926 gas station now, its mission simple but profound: to help people who'd been defrauded, embezzled from, systematically robbed by those they'd trusted. Karen had hired a small but exceptional staff, a lawyer named Patricia, who'd left a corporate firm after witnessing too much corruption, an investigator named James who specialized in financial crimes, and an administrator named Ruth, who'd herself been cheated out of an inheritance by her own children. They were quiet people, competent and discreet, who understood that some battles were won not with noise, but with meticulous preparation and unwavering patience. They operated from the main station building, which Karen had expanded slightly, adding a small conference room and offices that blended seamlessly with the 1926 architecture. When victims came to them, and they came regularly, referred by lawyers, advocacy groups, and increasingly by word of mouth, they found not just legal help, but genuine compassion. Patricia took their cases pro bono, funded entirely by Karen's careful liquidation of vault assets. James investigated tirelessly, following paper trails that others had dismissed as too complex or too old. Ruth managed everything with efficiency, born of personal understanding of what it felt like to be discarded by family. In their first 6 months, they'd helped recover over $3 million for 17 different victims: an elderly man whose son had drained his accounts, a widow whose financial advisor had systematically stolen her retirement savings, a group of workers whose employer had embezzled their pension fund. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same: people in positions of trust betraying those who depended on them. Karen funded the foundation entirely from the vault, using the treasures left by people who'd hoped for safety to provide safety for others. It felt right. It honored Marcus's grandfather's vision in a way that simply selling everything and living in luxury never could. Those desperate people who deposited their valuables here a century ago had trusted this place to keep their treasures safe. Now those same treasures were keeping others safe. The chain of faith continued. She'd also created a museum in a portion of the vault, the section nearest the stairs, where visitors could access it without penetrating too deeply into the secure areas. Some of the vault's items, those with clear historical significance and documented provenance, were now displayed to the public by appointment. Historians came from universities to study them. Journalists wrote respectful articles about the station's surprising history. Occasionally, families discovered connections to items their ancestors had deposited, bringing yellowed receipts or family stories passed down through generations. When that happened, Karen returned the items gladly, sometimes with tears in her eyes, honoring the trust that Marcus's grandfather had established so long ago. A man named David Levinson came with his grandmother's receipt from 1939, claiming a silver menorah his family had hidden before fleeing Vienna. A woman named Sophie Berger found her great-aunt's diamond ring, deposited in 1943, when the family scattered across continents. Each reunion was a small miracle, a promise kept across decades of darkness. But Karen kept most of the vault private, secure. The upper sections of the chamber remained accessible only to her, containing items that might still have owners somewhere, documents that deserved privacy. And yes, the fortune that funded everything she did. She'd had the security upgraded dramatically: biometric locks, silent alarms, systems that protected the vault better than any banks. But she'd kept the essential character of the place unchanged: the marble stairs, the brass railings, the amber lighting, the sense of sacred trust. She lived simply in her apartment at the station, surrounded by forest and the profound silence Marcus had spoken of in his note. She took walks each morning through the trees, following deer paths and bird songs, breathing air that smelled of pine and earth and growing things. She read books by the restored pot-bellied stove in winter, losing herself in stories while snow fell silently outside. She tended a small garden in summer, growing vegetables and flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. At 69, she'd never been more at peace. The trucking company, stripped of its stolen assets and corruption, she'd rebuilt from the foundation up. It was smaller now, just 12 trucks instead of 38, but every vehicle was properly maintained, every driver fairly paid, every contract honestly fulfilled. She'd given day-to-day management to Sam Martinez, who'd worked for Marcus for 20 years and knew the business inside and out. The company would never make her rich, but it made enough to sustain itself and provide good jobs for good people. That was wealth enough. More importantly, it honored Marcus's memory in a way that Vivienne's embezzling never could. One evening in early spring, when the forest was just beginning to wake from winter and the first wildflowers were pushing through the leaf litter, a young woman came to the station. She arrived at dusk, her small car navigating the dirt track carefully, parking respectfully away from the main building. She sat in her vehicle for several minutes before getting out, as if gathering courage. Sharon watched from her window, recognizing the hesitation, the hope mixed with fear. She'd seen it before in people who came seeking connections to the past. The young woman was perhaps 30, dressed in professional clothes that suggested she'd come straight from work. She carried a folder, always a folder, Karen had learned. Documents, proof, hope written on yellowed paper. Karen opened the door before the woman could knock. "Good evening, I'm Sharon Blackwell. You're welcome here." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm Sarah Chen. I think my family might have deposited something here, a long time ago. I know this sounds crazy, but I found some papers, and there was an address, and I looked it up, and..." She was speaking too quickly, nervous energy spilling out. Karen smiled gently. "Come inside. Let's have tea and talk properly. Whatever brought you here deserves time and respect." Inside, Karen made tea in her small kitchen, while Sarah sat at the counter, opening her folder with trembling hands. "My great-grandmother's name was Lin Chen," she began. "She fled China in 1937 when the Japanese invaded. She was trying to get to America with her family, her husband and 2 children. My grandmother was just a baby then. They had some money, some valuables they'd managed to take when they escaped. They made it to California eventually, but my great-grandmother always said she'd left something behind, something important. She died when I was 10, but I remember her talking about a station in the forest, a place where she'd hidden a treasure, planning to send for it once they were settled in America." Sarah pulled out a piece of paper, so old and fragile it was nearly transparent. "This is the receipt. It's been in our family for almost 90 years. My mother never believed it was real, thought great-grandmother had gotten confused in her old age. But after my mother died last year, I found it again, and I decided to try, to see if, maybe..." "May I?" Karen asked gently, holding out her hand. Sarah passed her the receipt. It was written in beautiful script on paper that had once been cream-colored, but was now sepia with age. "Deposit receipt, Blackwell Station, property of Lin Chen, deposited April 3rd, 1937. 1 jade sculpture, Phoenix Rising, value estimated at..." The rest was too faded to read, but Karen didn't need to read it. She knew every item in that vault. "I have this," she said quietly. "Your great-grandmother's treasure. It's been waiting for you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You have it? It's real?" She didn't imagine it. She didn't imagine it. And she trusted us to keep it safe until someone came to claim it. That someone is you. Come with me." Sharon led Sarah through the station to the counter. She opened the mechanism, revealed the control panel, activated the vault entrance. Sarah gasped when the floor slid aside and the marble stairs appeared, glowing with their amber light. They descended together, Karen moving slowly to give Sarah time to absorb the impossible reality of this place. At the bottom, in that vast chamber with its 100 years of kept promises, Karen led Sarah to one of the mahogany cabinets. "Your great-grandmother's deposit is in cabinet 12, drawer 7. It's been catalogued, protected, waiting. This whole vault was built for people like her, people who had to flee, who needed somewhere safe to leave what they couldn't carry, who hoped someday to return or send someone to reclaim it." She opened the drawer and pulled out a box wrapped in protective cloth. Inside, nestled in silk that had faded over decades, was a jade sculpture perhaps 8 inches tall. It depicted a phoenix in exquisite detail, wings spread wide, head thrown back, rising from stylized flames. The jade was a deep green that seemed to hold light within it, glowing faintly in the vault's illumination. Every feather, every flame was carved with such precision that the sculpture seemed to move in the flickering light. Sarah reached out with shaking hands, then pulled back. "I can't. It's so beautiful. I'm afraid I'll drop it." "You won't," Karen said firmly, placing the sculpture in Sarah's hands. "Your great-grandmother last touched this 88 years ago. She held it, brought it halfway around the world, trusted strangers to keep it safe, and hoped that someday her family would reclaim it. Today is that day. You've kept the faith she had. The phoenix is yours, as it should be." Sarah cradled the sculpture and cried, deep, wrenching sobs that echoed off the vault's stone walls. Charon stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, letting her release 88 years of family grief and hope and longing. Finally, Sarah looked up, tears still streaming. "How can I ever thank you? How can I possibly repay you for keeping this safe?" Karen thought about that question, about Marcus and his note, about his grandfather building this impossible place, about all those desperate people trusting their treasures to strangers, about the chain of faith that connected them all across decades and oceans. "You already have," she said softly, "by coming here, by honoring your great-grandmother's memory, by proving that trust kept across generations means something. That's payment enough." She paused, then added, "But if you want to do more, live well. Honor your family. Keep faith with those who come after you. And if you ever meet someone who's been cheated, betrayed, robbed by those they trusted, help them if you can. That's how we keep the chain unbroken. That's how we honor those who trusted us." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She held the phoenix sculpture, symbol of renewal, of rising from ashes, of hope surviving destruction, and understood that she wasn't just reclaiming a family treasure. She was part of something larger, a century of kept promises, a covenant of trust, a proof that some things endure. After Sarah left, driving carefully down the dirt track with the phoenix secured in her passenger seat, Karen sat alone in the vault for a long time. She thought about Lin Chen, carrying that sculpture across an ocean, leaving it here with strangers, hoping against hope that someday her family would return for it. She died without ever seeing it again, but today, her great-granddaughter had reclaimed it, completing a circle begun almost 90 years ago. These were the moments that mattered, Karen realized. Not the money, not the treasures, not the victory over Vivian, but these quiet reunions, these kept promises, these proofs that faith sometimes, not always, but sometimes, was rewarded. She climbed the marble stairs slowly, her knees reminding her that she was nearly 70, that time was moving forward as it always did. At the top, she closed the vault, reset the mechanism, locked everything secure. Tomorrow, there would be more work. More victims to help through the foundation, more items to catalogue and preserve, more trust to keep. But tonight she could rest, knowing she'd done what Marcus had trusted her to do, what his grandfather had built this place to do. She'd kept faith. She'd held silence. She'd honored the covenant. And that was enough. Marcus had trusted her with this. His grandfather had built it on trust. All those desperate people had trusted this place with their last treasures. And Karen had kept that faith, would keep it for whatever years remained to her. And when she was gone, the foundation would continue, the vault would endure, the station would stand in its forest clearing, a keeper of silences, a holder of truths. Vivian had tried to erase her, had tried to dismiss her as worthless, but Karen had learned long ago that worth wasn't determined by those who wanted to diminish you. It was determined by what you chose to protect, what promises you chose to keep, what faith you held even when no one was watching. She climbed the marble stairs, closed the vault, reset the counter. She locked the station and walked outside. The sun was setting through the trees, painting the mist gold and red. The station stood solid and beautiful, a monument to keeping faith. And Karen stood beside it, a woman of silence and strength, guardian of 100 years of trust, keeper of secrets, holder of truths. She'd been given ruins, and she'd found treasure. Not just the material wealth, but something far more valuable. She'd found purpose. She'd found peace. She'd found proof that quiet dignity and patient faith were more powerful than any amount of greed or cruelty. Vivian was gone. Marcus was at rest. The vault kept its secrets. And Karen, at 69 years old, finally understood what her husband had known all along. The answer was in the silence. The power was in the keeping. The victory was in the faith. She walked back inside her home, closed the door, and smiled. Tomorrow, she'd help more people. She'd honor more trusts. She'd keep more faith. But tonight, she'd rest in the silence, surrounded by a century of kept promises, knowing she was exactly where she belonged. If this story touched you, drop one word in the comments. And remember, those who try to bury you don't know you might be a seed ready to grow into something they'll never understand. What looks like endings are often beginnings. What looks like ruins often holds treasures. And those who keep faith, who hold silence, who wait with dignity, they're the ones who inherit not just wealth, but legacy. Karen's story proves it, and maybe yours will too. She walked back inside her home in the forest, the station that had been called worthless now glowing with purpose and light. She closed the door softly, locked it, and looked around at what she'd built from what others had called ruins. The silence surrounded her. Not the silence of loneliness, but the profound quiet of peace earned, of dignity maintained, of promises kept across a century. Tomorrow, more people would come seeking justice. More families might find treasures they thought lost forever. More trust would be kept, more faith honored. But tonight, Karen rested in her chair by the window, watching darkness settle over the forest, knowing she was exactly where she belonged. A keeper of silences, a holder of truths, a guardian of 100 years of trust. She'd been given what looked like nothing and found everything. And in that finding, she'd become something far more valuable than wealthy. She'd become worthy of trust itself. The answer had been in the silence all along, just as Marcus promised. Outside, the forest breathed in darkness, ancient trees standing guard over the station as they had for a century. Inside, Karen sat in perfect stillness, a woman who'd learned that real power wasn't loud or aggressive. It was patient. It was quiet. It was the strength to keep faith when no one was watching, to hold silence when others demanded noise, to wait with dignity for justice to arrive in its own time. Vivian had tried to bury her in these woods, had tried to erase her with ruins and isolation. Instead, she'd given Karen the keys to a kingdom built on trust, maintained by silence, and strengthened by the knowledge that some things, promises, faith, dignity, matter more than any fortune. The gas station stood in its clearing, lights glowing softly through restored windows, a beacon in the wilderness. Not a ruin, not an insult, but a testament to what endures when trust is kept, when faith is honored, when silence holds more power than any shout. Karen closed her eyes and smiled. She was home, she was at peace. She was exactly what Marcus always knew she'd be, a keeper of the silence, a guardian of the faith, forever.